Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I just want to talk a little bit about the about MMA, the modern history of MMA. We did a video on wrestling um, a while ago, so I feel like you can't really talk about wrestling without talking about its shoot cousin MMA. Now they have a very similar history. They go back to MMA actually goes back to ancient China, a Chinese art combining grappling and striking techniques called Lei Tai. But in Western discourse, mixed martial arts, the art of mixing striking with grappling goes back to ancient Greece, much like boxing and wrestling. You had boxing and you had wrestling, so they decided, why don't you combine both of them? And that's where you get pancratium. Pancratium. And this was an Olympic sport and first introduced into the Olympics in 648 BC. And like I said, it was an Olympic sport up until the end of the Olympics in 393 AD. I made the I made the mistake of saying it was 330 339. No, it was 393 BC. It was 393 AD. Like I said, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire, and the Olympic Games were seen as of pagan origin because the original intent of the Olympics was to honor the 12 Olympian gods, specifically Zeus, the father of the gods, and Christians, especially Theodosius the first official Christian emperor. Because although Constantine converted to Christianity, he was still tolerant somewhat of pagan rituals. But this didn't really put an end to martial arts per se in Europe, because the French martial art of savate, which is basically a kicking martial art, continued. And throughout the Middle Ages, you would have savate players compete against, say, boxers or whatever. They just weren't doing it in the Olympics, But and around the world, you still had this phenomenon occurring and going on. Now, fast forward to the 19th century. Like I said, the 19th century saw the rise of catch wrestling, the invention of catch wrestling, which is the ancestor to freestyle wrestling and modern day professional wrestling. But also, you had other people. You had a gentleman by the name of William Barton Wright. He combined elements of judo, he combined elements of catch wrestling, he combined elements of boxing, elements of jujitsu, elements of taekwondo, martial arts from around the world, and he created what is called baristu. And he tested this out on several occasions with other participants. But catch wrestling continued to grow and migrate, like I said, to the United States. And around Europe and the United States, it was performed in carnival circuits, small little carnival circuits, what they call athletic shows. And sometimes in these athletic shows, you would see somebody from the audience come out and challenge the champion, and that local person was not supposed to beat the champion, but sometimes they did, so they decided to work it. So you had two different types of catch wrestling competitions. You had works and you had shoots. Shoots were real competitions, and they were mostly done for competitors themselves, and works were, them working with the audience. One was for show and one was for sport. And basically, the show part of it came to dominate. Eventually, they found it to be more lucrative, so that the show part of the catch wrestling competitions became the modern day professional wrestling. People such as Toots Mont, people such as uh, Frank Gotch. Frank Gotch was a little bit earlier than Toots Mont. Toots Mont was about around the time of the 1920s. Frank Gotch himself had been in several competitions uh, with boxers, during his heyday. Even hell, William Muldoon, the first Greco-Roman champion in 1845, he became the Greco-Roman champion in 1845. But in 1887, he himself had a boxer versus wrestler match with his student, the Boston Strong Boy John L. Sullivan. But as John L. Sullivan was training for his 1889 fight with Jake Kilrain. So Frank Gotch had these competitions. Um, John L. Sullivan had these competitions. William Muldoon, all the greats from back then, because basically everybody was always curious about who had the best martial art. Was it jujitsu? Was it judo? Was it taekwondo? Was it karate? Who had the best? So by 19 a little bit of history going into Brazil. Lisa smiling. Hey, what's up, Lisa? We fast forward to Brazil, the 18th century. A gentleman from Japan by the name of Matsudo Maeda. Japan had a lot of Japanese immigrants. Um, just like other parts of Latin America after slavery was over, they had a lot of immigrants they recruited from Asia. And the Japanese were the main recruits going to Brazil. So this and remember, Brazil was the last country to end slavery in the 1880s. So in the middle 1800s, this gentleman, one of the Asian indentured laborers, Matsudo Maeda, migrates to Brazil. And he meets up with a Brazilian gentleman by the name of Helio Gracie. And he teaches Helio Gracie the art of jujitsu, the Japanese art of jujitsu, a famous art that was passed down from student to teacher, much like the Force in Star Wars, by Japanese samurai. This was not known to anybody. And Julio Gracie modifies it somewhat, and he becomes a master of it. And he becomes the master and the creator of what is called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So by the 1960s, he has a bunch of sons, and he believes, and the Gracies believe, that uh, by the 50s and 60s, they believe that their art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the best art, that it could go against boxing, it could go against wrestling, it could go against taekwondo, it could go against any other martial art, karate. So they have what they call the Gracie Challenge, challenging any other martial artist of any style of combat to go against them. And the first one is a Japanese gentleman by the name of Michikuru Kimura. And this is 1951 against Helio Gracie. Helio Gracie loses by submission to Kimura. And the lock he puts him in then becomes known as the Kimura lock. And but most of the time, it's he's successful. Becomes what they call in Portuguese the Vale Tudo tournament. So MMA as we know it in the modern era was born in Brazil. And Brazil also has a history of its own native martial art that doesn't come from Japan called capoeira. This martial art, it's mostly a dance now. They use it as entertainment and combat. It comes from the slaves during the transatlantic slave trade in Brazil, specifically from Angola and the Congo, that used it to rebel against their slave masters. But they disguised it as a dance. But still, many Brazilians know this particular martial art. It became endemic and a part of Brazilian culture. But another thing that became a part of Brazilian culture was this valet tudo tournaments, and they do this throughout the 50s and 60s on Brazilian TV. It becomes a sensation on Brazilian TV, but eventually the Brazilian government shuts it down and is replaced by a Brazilian version of fake pro wrestling. But the spirit of it is still there. The spirit of it, the germ of it is still there. Fast forward to 1976. Now, 1976 in the history of mixed martial arts is one of the most important dates in mixed martial arts history because this is the one of the now we talked about the original boxer versus wrestler matches, for example, that Frank Gotch was in, Judo Gene LaBelle, the wrestler from California, he was in. There was one in 1961 between and Luthez and Jersey Joe Walcott. There was one participated in that Joe Louis was involved with. There were several, but this one in 1976 was the most important in the modern era. And this is between Antonio Inoki and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, by the 1970s, by the late 1970s, had fallen on some hard times. And he wasn't as good as he used to be. You know what I mean? That like his his top era was the early 70s, like in the late 60s. A lot of years of his career were taken off of him because of the legal troubles he had, refusing to serve in Vietnam, refusing to be drafted. So he was having these financial troubles. So one of the ways he decided he was going to gain money was by getting into professional wrestling and challenging a wrestler. Now, um, Antonio Inoki had gone down to Brazil. He was a professional wrestler. He broke in. He was trained by Ricky Dozan. That was basically Ricky Dozan is the father of professional wrestling in Japan. And uh, and seeing that this type of thing was successful in Brazil, Antonio Inoki wanted to bring it globally. The idea that you could pit different martial arts against each other, boxer against wrestler, judo player uh, against kickboxer, um, sambo player, which sambo is a Russian martial arts invented in the 1920s, against somebody. Uh, Antonio Inoki wanted to prove that catch wrestling, professional wrestling, as taught to him by German wrestler Karl Gotch. Karl Gotch was a German wrestler who was basically kicked out of the professional wrestling circuit in the United States for getting into a fight with Buddy Rogers and breaking Buddy Rogers' arm. So being as he was disgraced by the wrestling scene in America, he went to Japan and he started teaching them the real wrestling, like real wrestling holds, catch wrestling holds, dating back all the way to the to the 19th century, that you could actually use to defeat somebody, real shoots. And these wrestlers took this to heart. And one of his students was Antonio Inoki. And Antonio Inoki believed, just like Julio Gracie believed, that his martial art, catch wrestling, was the superior martial art. And he wanted to prove this against Muhammad Ali. And again, Muhammad Ali needed the money. So Vince McMahon in this 1976, Ali did a lot of these gimmick fights. He did a fight with amateur boxer, the bleeder Chuck Webner, which the movie Rocky is based on. So Vince McMahon Sr., the promoter in the New York City area, hears about this and he wants to get behind it. And then Junior wants to get behind it too because Junior had just started getting into promotion. They wanted to initially push their champion, Bruno Sammartino, who's the champion of the WWF at that time, but he had gotten his neck legitimately broken by Stan Hansen earlier in the year. So the Japanese promoters put up the money and they decide they want Inoki to do it. Problem is, Ali thinks this is going to be fake. This is all going to be for show. Inoki's not thinking that. Inoki is like, no, I'm really going to go out there and I'm really going to fight him. Right? But how do we do this? This has never been done before on a big stage. Like I said, you had the Lufteses versus the Joe Walcott, the Judo Gene LaBelles and the Ray Steeles, that kind of thing. But that was not on a big stage. That was on a small stage. This was in front of everybody. A big time closed circuit pay-per-view. What were they going to do? So, and they have no idea how the rules are run. How do you do a mixed match? How do you do a boxer versus wrestler in a real fight? So Ali's people get scared. They're like, they don't want to see Ali get embarrassed. He's doing this to play around. He's doing this only for show. He's going around all the wrestling circuits. He's beating up Gorilla Monsoon. Getting into confrontations with Gorilla Monsoon on WWF or WWF TV or WWE or WWF at the time TV. They don't want to see him get embarrassed. So what they do is they tell Ali, you can fight him, but you can't grab him. You have to fight him laying down. Right? So the whole fight, he's kicking Ali in the shins. He's kicking him in the shins. Like, it's the most weirdest, awkwardest fight. Yeah, we're getting there, David. We're getting there. It's the weirdest, awkwardest fight that you have ever seen. This Ali and Inoki fight. But historically, it's very important because it's considered the first ever modern MMA fight. Now, what David is talking about, fast forward to 1993. The Gracies, they decide to, this man named Art Davies hears about these competitions that they do in Japan and they do in Brazil, because Inoki goes back to Japan and he continues to do these mixed matches. But some of his students, particularly Satoru Sayama, the original Tiger Mask, and Akira Maeda, they start their own kind of shoot promotions. They leave New Japan Pro Wrestling, his company, and they start their own shoot promotions like Shuto, and they start the Rings Network, right, and UWFI, right, in the late 80s. And these are still worked promotions, but they look kind of like legitimate promotions. They look very different than what wrestling fans are accustomed to. So Japan has that tradition. Brazil has that tradition. But America doesn't have it yet. So, and Pancrase is also started around that time, which is a semi-shoot organization. Ken Shamrock eventually gets hooked up with them, right? But America doesn't have it. So Art Davies hears about, he goes to the Gracie gym, and he hears about the Gracie Challenge. And he has the idea to bring it to the United States, right? And put it on pay-per-view. And this is a perfect opportunity for this, because at this time, boxing sucked at this time, because Mike Tyson was in jail. He went to jail in the early 90s. So he wasn't doing anything. Wrestling at this time, 1993, like David brought up, wrestling sucked at this time. Vince McMahon was going through his steroid trial, the steroid issues. Hulk Hogan wasn't really wrestling at this time, only briefly. And in WCW, the other major wrestling organization, they weren't doing anything really big because they were going through their own issues with Bill Watts, with Bill Watts getting fired in early 1992 and really going through a transitional period themselves. So both wrestling and boxing were sucking at this time. So the pay-per-view market was open for this new type of thing. But the problem is they didn't know how to market it. How do you market this? It's not boxing because you can slam people to the ground, you can grab people, you can uh you can kick. It's not wrestling because it's real. You know what I mean? So how do you market this? You market this like there's no precedent for this in the United States in the pay-per-view market. So they market it as no holds barred fighting. And basically they go around with the tagline that anything is possible. They even say that people could die. You know what I mean? In the octagon. And that's the thing too. Because um because there was a lot of input from John Milius, the action movie director. It was very movie-esque, right? They wanted to have a moat initially in the octagon with alligators and water and stuff, but they settled on the octagon. They settled on an octagon-shaped ring, and that eventually became their trademark. And they adopted the name the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And you know, people were skeptical because they're like, okay, this looks like wrestling. This kind of feels like boxing, but it's neither. It's neither fish nor fowl. So how do you make of it? First match, the sumo wrestler Tula Tuli. He gets his teeth knocked out. Right in the front row, the teeth go flying. And people are just like, what the fuck is it? And then Hoist Gracie comes out, representing Gracie Jiu Jitsu. He's the littlest guy there. He's wearing his Jiu Jitsu gi. The motherfucker is tearing it up. And he's introducing the world to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, a martial art that had been previously unknown. And eventually, over time, Ken Shamrock becomes a star, Dan Severn becomes a star, Tank Abbott becomes a star, Kimo Leopoldo becomes a star. All these different stars, and they start doing better pay-per-view numbers than both wrestling and boxing. And it starts scaring people. This is the no holds barred era. It starts really scaring people because there are very little rules. Almost MMA Prime. Hold on, David. Oh, that started sometime in the 2000s, David. Um, so this thing started really scaring people because people didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't wrestling and it wasn't boxing. It was real fighting, but it was successful. People loved this. So John McCain, the senator from Arizona, goes around to all the other senators in the country and gets them to ban this new sport, originally called no holds barred fighting or called shoot fighting. The name MMA comes from a gentleman, a sports writer by the name of Howard Rosenberg, and he to basically clean up the image of no holds barred fighting. He comes up with the name of mixed martial arts. And Jeff Blatnick, one of the original UFC announcers, decides, you know what, that's a cool word for it, and it becomes known as mixed martial arts. But MMA really struggled because the UFC specifically, because they couldn't pay their fighters. because they couldn't get sanctioned anywhere. By 1997, the only place they could perform any shows was in Dothan, Alabama, by the time Joe Rogan signs with the company. But in Japan, they're still doing their thing in Japan. In 1994, 1995, Pride becomes uh, Pride becomes an organization, and this is basically the golden era of mixed martial arts in Japan. Unlike in the United States, where everything basically went dark before 2000. Pride has all the best fighters, but the problem with Pride is that a lot of the fights were fake, a lot of them were fixed, and a lot of them um, it was controlled by the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. So that's why they ended up going out of business in 2007. But what happens in 2000? 2000, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, the Fertitta brothers, two guys uh, from Las Vegas, one of the first states to legalize mixed martial arts. They decide to invest and to buy the UFC. The UFC is on its ass. Art Davies eventually sells it to SEG, the company that produced the first few UFC pay-per-views. They horribly mismanage it, and it's about to go out of business. Vince McMahon, David, I don't know if you know this or you heard this. In 1997, Vince McMahon is approached by his son with an opportunity to buy the UFC. Shane McMahon likes the UFC. He's interested in it. He wants to buy it. And his father turns it down. His father says, "No, we're not doing that. That's barbaric." Once he heard about it, he's, "No, we're not doing that. That's barbaric." you know? So Vince believes, like everybody else, that MMA is barbaric, and has no interest in buying the UFC. He passes it up. But the Fertitta brothers do have interest in it, and so does Dana White. Who is Dana White? Dana White is he basically, you know, didn't really do anything much in his early life. Worked regular jobs until he got involved with celebrity boxing and boxing training. He always wanted to be a boxing promoter, but he eventually gets chased out of Boston supposedly by the Winter Hill gang, Whitey Bulger's mafia in South Boston, and he goes to Las Vegas, where he hooks up again with the Fertitta brothers. He lived in Las Vegas for a while in his youth, and he went to high school with the Fertitta brothers. But he has no interest initially in MMA itself. He's a boxing guy. He's a boxing purist. He believes boxing, 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 until he meets up with Chuck Liddell. And it's Chuck Liddell who converts him to the gospel of MMA. And he becomes a believer, and he becomes the Apostle Paul of MMA. He becomes a third investor in Zuffa LLC. Zuffa, Zuffa, and the Italian word for fight, because the Fertitta brothers are Italians. And Dana White, the three of them decide to buy the UFC in 2000. And also in 2000 is when a lot of the changes go about. The New Jersey State Athletic Commission, the California State Athletic Commission, they legalize MMA, and the new unified rules of MMA are codified. So MMA is starting to enter its mainstream, especially when it gets one of its biggest stars back in 2002. It gets back Ken Shamrock. And Ken Shamrock versus versus Tito Ortiz. And UFC 40 becomes in 2002 becomes the one of the biggest selling MMA pay-per-views in years. And again, once again, just like it was before in the 90s, wrestling has died down. The Attitude Era is coming to a close, the successful Attitude Era. And Ken Shamrock was a part of that by jumping from the UFC to the WWE in 1997. Although Vince McMahon had no interest in buying the UFC itself, he had interest in bringing UFC stars over to the WWE to convert them to professional wrestlers. And he did that with some success. Some would say he dropped the ball with Shamrock and Dan Severn, but he did it with some success. And his Attitude Era is now coming to a close. Everything is changing in the pay-per-view market. Likewise, boxing that had a renaissance after Mike Tyson got out of jail. He had the feud with Evander Holyfield. He had the feud with Lennox Lewis, but he had the match with Lennox Lewis. He retired. So boxing is undergoing tremendous changes in the early 2000s as well. So with Ken Shamrock coming back, UFC is primed to make a comeback and make a return, and that's exactly what they do under this new management. They modernize everything. Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, they become stars. And in the early 2000s, the late 2000s rather, boy oh boy, MMA blows up. MMA is everywhere. You'll find MMA organizations like the WEC, which UFC eventually merged with, Affliction, all these other companies, Elite XC becomes the first MMA organization to air on free TV with the internet sensation Kimbo Slice coming out of Florida. MMA is blowing up. But what, besides Shamrock coming back and besides the development of stars like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, one of the things that precedes this is the introduction of the Ultimate Fighter. MMA didn't have TV shows, right? It was basically an all pay-per-view phenomenon. But the phenomenon of reality TV had started. Survivor premiered in the early 2000s on CBS. Reality TV has been something, it existed since the 70s, but it really blew up in the 90s with the show The Real World, right? So that was on cable, but network TV discovered reality TV with Survivor in CBS in the early 2000s. So they weren't going to do week-to-week TV like wrestling, but they could tap into the pay-per-view, the reality TV show market. So they create the idea of the Ultimate Fighter, basically a spin on the real world. Instead of, just random people living in a house together, it would be MMA fighters. And at the end, two MMA fighters would fight to get a contract with the UFC. And the last two are Rich Franklin and Stephan Bonnar in the first Ultimate Fighter in 2005. But this is connected to wrestling too, because this is on Spike TV. Spike TV decides to air the Ultimate Fighter after Monday Night Raw. So fans that are watching Monday Night Raw, the carryover, David, is from Monday Night Raw to mixed martial arts, from Monday Night Raw to the UFC. Fans that have watching Monday Night Raw, they'll stick around and they'll say, what is this new UFC? And a whole new generation, because of the carryover from Monday Night Raw to Ultimate Fighter on the same station in 2005, discover UFC. But the problem is, UFC becomes so successful on Spike TV that it becomes more successful than WWE, and they eventually kick WWE off the station, and they just have UFC. And Vince McMahon has this discussion with Dana White. He calls Dana White up and he says, listen, why would Why would they want to watch my fake fights when they could watch your real ones? So WWE is forced to go back to the USA Network. Again, UFC is burning it up. So by the late 2000s, uh, they buy out their competition. One of the most successful mergers in all of sports history between Pride FC and the UFC. So now they have no competition until a little while later when Strikeforce gets started. And you know they bring a lot of people over from Pride. They bring over Vanderlei Silva. They bring over Quentin Rampage Jackson. That's the era, um, the early 2010s when you have the GSPs. The late 2000s, early 2010s, GSP is rising up. Anderson Silva is rising up. And I remember this era. This era was so exciting, so great to be an MMA fan. First discovering MMA for the first time because I had, like I said, in 1994, 1993, I had seen mixed martial arts. I had seen the early UFCs. The first one I saw, right? The era of the Hoist Gracies and Ken Shamrocks and Severns. But after it went black, I couldn't follow it anymore. Much like anybody else couldn't follow it because you couldn't find it anywhere. But then, I was one of those people that after Raw went off every week, I would follow there and I would watch The Ultimate Fighter. And that Rich Franklin Stephan Bonner fight was so bloody and so cool that got me hooked on mixed martial arts. So they continue their dominance, and Strikeforce, the other MMA organization, introduces women's MMA. Initially, Dana White had said that he was not, uh, Spike TV's Canadian affiliate, um, with the show Michael Landsberg. On Off the Record, he would always interview the WWE wrestlers. So when UFC became popular, he interviewed Dana White as well, right? And Dana White said he would never feature women in MMA. But Strikeforce was doing it. Strikeforce had initially Cyborg Santos, Gina Carano, right? And then they introduced a former Olympic judo player, Rowdy Ronda Rousey. And Ronda Rousey, in the early 2010s, she starts beating everybody like she's the female Mike Tyson. She starts knocking bitches out, right? She's taken the world by storm, basically. And well, she's not knocking them out. She's making them tap out. You know what I mean? Because her strikes are, they weren't up to par. And when they buy out Strikeforce, right, in 2013, she goes over to there with them and she becomes the first star in female MMA. And for about 2 years, up until when she got knocked out by Holly Holm, and Lisa remembers this fight because Lisa made a video, her and her friend, on this fight of how Ronda Rousey basically revealed her weakness was kicks, and then Ronda Rousey gets her ass kicked by Holly Holm, and she's completely embarrassed. So here you have one of the first mainstream stars of mixed martial arts in the modern era in the 2010s getting embarrassed and getting basically destroyed. Her face looked like, uh, she looked like fucking the thing from the Goonies, right? And they found out she was all hype. She comes back later and she has another match with Amanda Nunes, the Lioness, and she gets defeated there as well. They ran her out of MMA and she had to, in 2018, she goes to wrestling. But Conor McGregor also becomes a star. Conor McGregor has a lot of charisma. In the late 2010s, McGregor becomes a star. And it is McGregor that becomes the first mega star besides Rousey and besides Brock Lesnar. Let's talk a little bit about Brock Lesnar. By 2008, because Brock Lesnar comes to WWE in 2002, He becomes the youngest WWE champion in history by defeating The Rock at SummerSlam 2002. He has a hell of a run in WWE for 2 years. He's former NCAA champion. He could compete in MMA right away if he wanted to, but he doesn't. He goes to to WWE at that time because again, WWE is more lucrative. WWE is more successful, so he goes there. But by 2004, he wants to compete again. He's a competitive man. He's not satisfied with fake wrestling. He's not satisfied with professional wrestling. He wants something more competitive. So, and he doesn't like the road life. So he has the match with Goldberg at WrestleMania 20. He leaves the WWE and he goes to the NFL at first. And but he's cut from the Vikings. So by 2008, he decides he's going to train in MMA. He has his first MMA match in Japan, loses, has a match with Frank Mir and also loses, but has an impressive showing. Dana White realizes the star power in Brock Lesnar because although Brock wasn't a part of the Attitude Era, he was a part of the Ruthless Aggression Era, the era that immediately came after the Attitude Era, and he was one of its biggest stars. So Dana White recognizes that the potential behind Brock Lesnar, so he puts him in the ring with Randy the Natural Couture. Randy Couture is was a legend even by this time in MMA, right? One of the first competitors during the dark years of MMA. You know, when UFC created their first world champion in 1997, Mark Coleman, one of his first challengers that debuted that year in 97 was Randy Couture. Oddly enough, against a former pro wrestler, Tony Hallamay, aka Ludwig Borga, was Randy Couture's first match. So Randy Couture comes out of retirement to face Lesnar, and Lesnar beats him. So Brock Lesnar becomes the UFC heavyweight champion in 2009. 8-9, right? And Lesnar holds the pay-per-view record for a very long time, up until McGregor. McGregor comes in, and then McGregor starts becoming the big mainstream star of the UFC. And then you have guys like John Jones and his feuds in the early 2010s with Daniel Cormier, that start catching a lot of people's attention. But mainly it is Conor McGregor. He actually breaks the mold in UFC 206 when him and Nate Diaz have their first UFC fight in Madison Square Garden. Initially, Vince McMahon, and again, this goes back to McMahon again. McMahon blocked UFC from performing in Madison Square Garden. Like the whole time UFC is blowing up, Vince McMahon is saying, "Oh, I don't consider them competition. I don't consider them competition. We're scripted. They're real. They're more like boxing." But in actuality, he does. You know what I mean? Because why would he try to block them on the USA Network when they wanted to get on the USA Network? Why would he try to block them on Spike initially, even though he gave the go-ahead for Spike at first? Why would he try to block them in Madison Square Garden? It gets legalized in New York by Mayor de Blasio and Governor, I think Andrew Cuomo was governor at that time. Right, it gets legalized in New York. It's 2016. Legalized in New York, and McGregor and Diaz have that fight, and it's a sellout, man. You know what I mean? And McGregor is becoming so big on the national stage that he has a match with Floyd Mayweather, because Floyd Mayweather was the pay-per-view king in the late 2000s. He had his match with Oscar in boxing, and Oscar De La Hoya In 2007, they broke all kinds of pay-per-view records. Had another match with highly anticipated with Manny Pacquiao, right? And basically, for Mayweather, there was nobody left to beat. But McGregor was similar in MMA. So they were like, well, what if we did MMA versus boxing? And Mayweather had gone on TV because much like wrestling, boxing was shook too because they were losing out. Other than Mayweather, they were losing out. This is the era when you had guys like Miguel Cotto and Sugar Shane Mosley, and none of these guys' fights were selling at all compared to MMA fighters that you would have up there, like the John Jones, the Conor McGregors, the Brock Lesnar's, the Ronda Rouseys. MMA fighters were becoming household names. Later on, Khabib Nurmagomedov, you know what I mean? They were becoming household names, and boxing was struggling. So boxing promoters like Bob Arum, right, were talking hella shit about MMA, that MMA is for skinheads and MMA is barbaric, and MMA is on the level with pro wrestling, which boxing promoters never looked at as legitimate anyway, right? So all these boxing promoters are talking shit. So they're like, okay, have your best guy going against our best guy. 2017, August 26, 2017. I'll never forget it. It's my birthday. We have what they call the fight of the century, Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather. Now, it ended up being a spectacle, but it ended up attracting a lot of attention for mixed martial arts. People that had never paid attention to mixed martial arts suddenly were paying attention to this guy, McGregor, because people wanted to see Mayweather get beat. Obviously, it didn't work because it it, he submitted McGregor. You know what I mean? But it was a huge spectacle. But it was boxing. You know what I mean? McGregor. Mayweather didn't want to step into the octagon in McGregor's world, obviously. But this became a trend because UFC fighters lost a lot of money, a ton of money, a shit ton of money on their endorsement deals because UFC signed a deal with Reebok in 2015. Basically, now Reebok can become their only sponsor. All their gear would be made by Reebok. So this was terrible for fighters now. They lost most of their sponsorships. And also, but in 2016, William Morris Entertainment, which would later become Endeavor, purchases the UFC for $4 billion. So once again, the UFC changes hands from the Zuffa brother, Zuffa by the Fertitta brothers and Dana White, to Ari Emanuel and William Morris Entertainment. Initially, people read this as WWE buys UFC in 2016, but it was WME, William Morris Entertainment, a Hollywood talent agency, which could be good for MMA fighters to gain notoriety and to gain popularity in movie roles. Some say this was good. Some say this was terrible for MMA. And basically, 2016 was the year that MMA became corporate. 2016 and 17, and by 18, they finally leave Fox Sports Net, which they had been with in the early 2000s, to go to an exclusive deal with ESPN as their main pay-per-view and streaming distributor. So basically now their pay-per-view structure, where you just had to buy the original UFC pay-per-view, now you have to qualify for the app, purchase the app, become a member of ESPN in the Disney Plus bundle, and also purchase the pay-per-view all at the same time. So this is basically screwing a lot of the fans. So because of this, they lost a lot of deals in 2018. But by 2019, things looked great for UFC, honestly. But then the pandemic hits. And when the pandemic hit, they could no longer hold pay-per-views anymore. But finally, they strike a deal with the government of the UAE of Abu Dhabi, right? And they develop Fight Island, basically this secluded island where they can conduct their own fights without being bothered by the restrictions of the pandemic. They are the first mainstream sport to come back after the pandemic in 2021. Because Dana White, he was not he was not going to be deterred by any restrictions from the Democrats. Obviously, he's a hardcore Republican. He spoke at the RNC in 2016 in support of Donald Trump. Donald Trump had been involved with MMA for a while. He had been a minority holder in the Strikeforce MMA League. You know what I mean? So he's a fan of the fights, right? And he became friends with Dana during his first term from 2017 to 2021. And Dana, like I said, made money hand over fist during the pandemic because he was one of the only sports out there. They grew and they grew, they grew and they grew exponentially, just like the WWE did. The WWE also, in entertainment, WWE was the only one performing, and in sports, UFC was the only one performing. These two companies would meet up again in 2023 when Endeavor, now William Morris Entertainment changed their name to Endeavor. They purchased the WWE and they decided to combine the two companies to form TKO Group Holdings on September 12th, 2023. So basically, 30 years after the founding of the UFC, now it is more profitable than both WWE and boxing, to the point where the people that own them could buy out the WWE from Vince McMahon. It's been an amazing story with UFC, but unfortunately, since the merger, since the formation of TKO, UFC hasn't been doing any good. How is MMA as a whole around the world? Well, you have still you have still Bellator MMA. After Francis Ngannou walks out of the company, right? Francis Ngannou has he was the champion at the time. He has problems, with the pay structure. He walks out of the company and he goes to PFLP, another company. PFLP later in 2024 buys out Bellator. So Bellator MMA still exists, but they're kind of a minor league. UFC, their assets are like 12 billion by the time the merger with WWE happens, right? And that is basically it. Thank you, Lisa, for joining. Thank you, for David, for joining. I think you guys dropped out. Sorry for bored the two of you. You know what I mean? But that's just my little 2 cents with regards to the history of MMA. Peace.